13.4 is the lesson. The question is, what strains did industrialization place on Canadian society? We're going to learn all about that and more. So stick around and... It is 13.4 for our lesson today. What strains did industrialization place on Canadian society? And oh, let me tell you, there were some challenging times because of industrialization. We are an industrialized society after all, and of course, that growth that happens, there will be some pain that comes along with that growth. But good things will happen, like the expanding economy and economic boom. That is going to bring prosperity to a lot of people. But there's always another side. There's going to be some social problems as well. So social problems begin to emerge. We now have overcrowded cities. Overcrowded cities are going to be dirty, they're going to be unhealthy, and they're not going to be a pleasant place for people to live. This expanding society is going to bring a gap in our wages. We will have some rich and we will have some poor. We'll have everybody in between as well. And other social problems will emerge, like competition for wealth on a national or international stage. That's going to lead to war. And that's what we're going to talk about first. The First World War, which began in 1914 and lasted until 1918. At the time of the First World War, Germany had built the world's largest army. And in response to that, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, France, and Russia built large armies. And with these armies came national pride. National pride would develop because of these armies. Look how strong I am. Look at us. We are French. We are British. We are Russian. We are American. This national pride develops. In 1914, Archduke Ferdinand is assassinated while in his open horseless carriage, the automobile. And this was an excuse now to bring the world into war to test some weapons. Now, that's a very, very simplistic reasoning there for the start of World War I. But for what we need to know here in our curriculum, it started with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, and now these countries are entering into war. The war was mainly fought in Europe, and Canada was included in this war. But we did not fight as Canadians. We did not fight as Canada. We were part of the British Empire. The factories that we had here in Canada and around the world, they switched from making consumer goods, some of them, not all of them, they switched from making consumer goods to making war goods. So guns, ships, aircraft, even chemicals as well to fight in these wars. In 1918, Germany does surrender and the war ends, and the casualty of war for the First World War was 9 million deaths. So a lot of people were impacted by this war. Canada fought as part of the British Empire, but we still use that war to contribute to our Canadian identity. And that happened in Vimy Ridge in France. The French and the British were struggling to capture this town, which was a crucial spot in victory for the Allies. And in April of 1917, Canadians fought, and they fought hard to capture Vimy Ridge. This battle lasted 5 days. After that 5 days, 3,598 Canadians had died in this battle in 5 days in Vimy Ridge. An additional 7,000 were wounded. This victory, it was a victory. It was a very painful victory. It came at an extremely high cost, but this led to national Canadian pride and worldwide respect because it was the Canadians who were able to capture Vimy Ridge. As these Canadian soldiers were coming back from Vimy or from other parts of Europe, they were settling into an industrial cities all throughout Canada. And the end of the war brought many changes to Canada. Now, these factories that were making war goods, now they turned back to consumer goods. And now we're starting to see more factories built in urban areas where these soldiers were returning. That combined with farmers moving to the cities, because a lot of farming jobs were being replaced by new farming technologies, required more homes and more buildings to be built. So we have now iron workers that are building office buildings. And now we're starting to see the development of city cores. Okay, so like your downtown areas. And by the 1920s, more Canadians began to live in urban areas compared to those farming communities outside of the cities, which further changed our Canadian identity and led to the growth of suburbs, which many of us live in today. So the city's centers were tight, close quarters. Now the people were moving into the suburbs where there was a more of a neighborhood feel, which is similar to what we have today. Now, technology is always improving. So what is introduced is the streetcar is introduced, which starts running down the middle of streets and it's powered by electricity. Now we have the ability to move large amounts of people a distance within, a short amount of time, which then allowed people to move into those suburbs, which is going to be along the city's core edge. And if you look at at Edmonton as an example, the city is very spread out because of these suburbs. And you can see here what industrialization has done over the years to some major Canadian cities. Look at Toronto, for example. In 1891, Toronto had a smaller population than Montreal. Toronto had just over 181,000 people. And in 2004, they had over 5 million people. So this is going to be changing the way we view cities, and that's going to change our identity. The identity may be changing, but people are still working in factories. And we know from the previous lesson that the factories weren't the best places to work. Okay, they did have a lot of issues. Remember, factories were built with machines in mind, not people in mind. And because of that, there were few rules to protect employees. You could be hired and fired at will. Doesn't matter. Somebody doesn't like you, they can fire you. Somebody does like you, they can hire you. The wages weren't good, and workers had zero or no say, no to zero to very little say in their rights. So over time, unions begin to form in response to these factories not being a great place to work. So what a union is a union speaks for workers. They speak for all the workers that belong to that union, and they work to improve working conditions. So maybe better wages, shorter working hours. Why are we working 12 hours a day? And safer working conditions. Unions also have the power to strike. And there was a strike in Winnipeg in 1920, the Winnipeg General Strike. This is where the unionized workers refuse to go to work until an employer agrees to whatever conditions are brought forward by the union members. There were a lot of strikes after World War I when these soldiers were returning from battle, but the largest one did take place in Winnipeg. Multiple unions at the time went on strike, and that was called a general strike. So the phones were shut down. There was no mail. The streetcar services were shut down. And the police supported the strike. What did they want? Well, the workers wanted higher wages, and the workers wanted recognition. They wanted to be protected. But the employers thought that they had much more power, and they refused to negotiate. So the mayor of Winnipeg calls in the Royal Northwest Mounted Police to take care of business. After all was said and done, 2 people died and 30 people were injured in the Winnipeg General Strike. After the strike took place, people began to look at politicians to speak on their behalf, and as opposed to maybe unions doing so. So now they started taking a look at these politicians. So the farmers, they got together and they formed the National Progressive Party in 1921. the National Progressive Party, opposed tariffs, so which would make farming equipment cheaper, and they opposed the influence of business in government. And they actually became the official opposition at the federal level in Ottawa for quite some time. Farmers also got together and they formed wheat pools, which basically, to simplify it, they refused to buy wheat on the world market, and they also refused to sell their wheat on the world market. So all the wheat that you can buy and sell has to be Canadian. But again, the sharing of wealth is not going to be equal. You have some that will prosper, you have some that will not prosper, and then you've got the majority of the people in between. But the First Nations did not prosper as other Canadians did. So, for example, in the mining industry, miners who were working in that industry did not realize that chemical waste is damaging to the environment. Oftentimes, that environment is where our First Nations are living. And the lives of other Canadians, though, did improve. So, for example, working conditions became much safer. People started to begin to receive benefits, so help when they were sick or when they lost their jobs, and farmers gained more control within their industry too. So some lives did improve, others did not. All right, I want you to head over to your notebook and complete the questions for this part of the chapter.